You are now listening to Music Marketing Metaphysics Podcast Radio Show, presented by AdeptInitiates.com, dedicated to the expansion of consciousness and the truth seekers of all time. And now your host, Anyextee.
Transmitting the teachings from Los Angeles, California. I'm your host, Anyextee, and this is Music Marketing Metaphysics Podcast Radio Show, presented by AdeptInitiates.com.
This episode is brought to you by AncientEgyptMysterySchools.com. Immerse yourself in the hidden teachings of the ancient mystery traditions. For thousands of years, initiates have examined the meanings of sacred texts, said to hold the secret path towards ascension. But how can we decipher these often enigmatic phrases and symbols? Join the line of ascended masters on a quest for deeper truths of our universe. Follow along as we trace the powerful evolution of humankind's most illuminating secrets. Begin to embark on your journey today and discover your divine rite of passage at AncientEgyptMysterySchools.com.
And we are back with another edition of Music Marketing Metaphysics Podcast Radio. Now, folks, this is going to be a very special episode. First, my co-host for today's show is Ramon Gouveia, a filmmaker, digital media strategist, researcher, and a frequent contributor for the Adept Initiates blog at AdeptInitiates.com. Now, he's actually spent some time in the field in South America with today's special guest, where Ramon's had the opportunity to have a hands-on experience with the elongated Paracas skulls, courtesy of our guest today, who has been featured on History Channel's Ancient Aliens and George Noory's Coast to Coast AM. He's an author, researcher, and renowned authority on the Paracas culture of Peru, and he's one of the most down-to-earth guys in the field. Our special guest today is Brien Foerster. Brien, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Brien, it's an honor to finally have you on the show. Thanks for carving time out of your busy schedule between your research, writing, and adventures around the world. We know it's a big day for you with the release of your brand new Akhenaten book, and I do want to discuss that. But first, the big question that's been heavily debated for the last several thousand years. Your research has taken you all over the world, South America, Egypt, Hawaii. What do you think? Was there an Atlantis?
I think there were advanced civilizations 12,000 plus years ago. According to Plato, it was about 11,700 to 11,900 years ago when so-called Atlantis disappeared. And at that time, science has shown us that the world's oceans have risen by more than 300 feet. So I think that's what Plato was trying to get at. Not that the continent sank, but that the ocean rose. And I'm sure they have found remains of civilizations underwater. So I believe, quote unquote, Atlantis did exist.
Awesome. I mean, I definitely think that it's a good point. You know, trying to really wrap our heads around exactly what it is one of the biggest issues in what surrounds the controversy. So speaking a little bit about some of the more practical evidence of some kind of advanced civilization, I know I've spent some time in Peru with you. Can you talk a little bit about some of the more compelling things you've found all over South America and the rest of the world that would suggest there was this advanced civilization?
Well, basically, I would say that in the Cusco area, you have megalithic works such as Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and the core of Machu Picchu itself. And these works are so complicated in stone that there's no way that the Bronze Age Inca could have done them. And so also the weathering of the stone is so excessive that even geologists that we've had in the field admit that they were constructed several thousand years ago. The Inca only appeared in the Cusco area about 1,000 years ago. So I think that's the most compelling, as well as Tiwanaku and Pumapunku on the Altiplano of Bolivia, and many of the famous and not so famous works in Egypt.
You talked a little bit about the weathering, which I know some of the more interesting theories that have come out of Egypt. And I know you've spent some time in Egypt, so I do want to talk a little bit about that. But some of the more compelling evidence for the older structures is that weathering. And are you saying that you've seen some of that in South America as well?
Definitely, and actually I've asked, quite recently in July, we had Susan, who's a geologist from Canada, and we looked at some of the weathering patterns, and I said, would you estimate that this would be hundreds or thousands of years? And she said, definitely thousands. So that predates the Inca, and supposedly there were no civilizations whatsoever except nomadic people living in the Cusco area prior to the Inca. So that, that tells us that it was a civilization from a long, long time ago.
And what are some of the timelines that are really being thrown out right now? Because, obviously mainstream archaeology is stuck on this story that really not much is older civilization-wise than maybe 5,000, 6,000 years old. And, what they would consider sort of flukes every now and again. When we're talking about the dates of some of these structures, have you come to any theories or ideas of how far back this civilization or these civilizations may have existed?
Yeah, I recently wrote a book called Aftershock about the global cataclysm that occurred 11,700 to 11,900 years ago globally. And that gives us the evidence. It's going to make some people either mad or laugh or whatever, but I think we're talking 12,000 plus years ago is when the advanced civilizations existed. They were completely destroyed. That's why we see cataclysmic damage in some of the, or many of the structures, is that this was like earthquakes of 9.9 or 10 or beyond, as well as volcanic activity. Again, the world's ocean rose by 300 feet. So I think the term that Stephen Mailer and I use is pre-cataclysmic. And so our timeline for pre-cataclysmic is 12,000 years.
Speaking of volcanic activity, one of the reasons I'm excited to have you on the show today, Brien, is I've had the opportunity to explore all of the known sacred sites in Hawaii. I've spent months at a time exploring the islands and talking to the locals, and I'm just fascinated with the ancient indigenous mythology, things like the Night Marchers and the Menehune. Now, the locals there will look at you with conviction in their eyes and tell you that these beings exist. And what I found interesting was the Menehune, these small beings which locals consider to be like elves or dwarfs, are actually posted on the signs that the government puts up at the entrance to these sites. They're acknowledged by the government as the builders of some of these ancient shrines, obviously paying homage to the oral tradition. So many of our listeners may not know this, but you've actually written about this, and it wasn't until I read your book, The Real History of Hawaii, that I discovered how the word may have come to be. And I really thought you brought a fresh perspective on this. So can you tell us a bit about the Menehune and the origin of the word?
No, that's a great question. And yeah, the answer comes from the oral tradition of the people. I've been visiting Hawaii since I was about 12, and I lived there for more than 2 years. And since I was involved in a Hawaiian cultural project, the Hawaiian aunties and uncles who still live there, who carry the oral tradition, told me a lot of stuff, and that's why I wrote this book. So according to them, it's not Menehune, it's probably Manahuna, and that means people of little power. And the story goes that prior to the Tahitian invasion in the 1200s, there were other people, or there was another civilization living in Hawaii who were very peaceful, and that's where the a term like of little power comes from, because the Tahitians were very aggressive warrior people, and they easily decimated, absorbed, and chased away these remaining Menehune or Manahuna people, who are described as being normal height. So the whole idea of them being little people is a corruption of the oral tradition. Again, if you use a term like little power, you might think of little stature, etc. So they're regarded as having been a very peaceful people who had no defensive or offensive weapons. They're also described as having very dark red hair. So that's not a Polynesian characteristic. And they were chased through the island, starting on the Big Island. And then by the time they reached Kauai, which was their last stronghold, and then were being attacked there, they supposedly went to a little island called Mokumanamana, which has ancient megalithic-type remains on it. And from there, the story goes that they went home to Easter Island.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And one of the things that I really love about your research is this exploration of the idea that maybe the migration patterns that we've accepted, the Bering Strait crossing, may not actually be the whole story. And so before we get into sort of the nitty gritty of one of the most exciting finds that you presented recently with the DNA findings, I know you're a big proponent of the sort of interdisciplinary approach to this whole subject, bringing in geologists to look at rocks, bringing in a surgeon to look at skulls. Can you tell us a little bit about your approach when you're exploring these sites, and sort of when you're going out in the field and doing this research? What are some of the things that you take into consideration, when you're trying to basically gather this information?
Well, the unfortunate thing is that history has been the domain of archaeologists and anthropologists almost exclusively, who don't have a tendency to consult with other experts, such as geologists, stonemasons, and also not paying respect to the oral tradition. So I've ever since I was a child and spent time with Native American people, I always wanted to hear their perspective, because they've been living on these continents for at least 12,000 years, whereas so-called Western civilization has been since the Mayflower or something like that. So I try to gather information from as many disciplines as possible in the field, if possible, with, say, a geologist or physicist or anatomist or whatever. And actually, that's the prime function of the tours we do, is for me to lure experts to actually pay to come to Peru or Egypt, and then pick their brains constantly as they explore the sites, because everyone has a different, have different eyes and different approaches at looking. And the more of those different approaches you can absorb, the more you can develop a collective picture.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. No single set of eyes will really be able to solve these complex mysteries. Having seen some of these sites firsthand, particularly in Peru and Bolivia, I think it helps to have a team of people, each with some kind of specialized knowledge. So speaking of interdisciplinary approach, I want to jump to something really fascinating that blew up online a few months back. You posted about a strange creature found in Mexico that was in a jar. Now, having spent some time with you personally, I can definitely attest that you're a pretty rational, logic-minded guy. So can you tell us about this fairy creature?
Sure. Well, if I had just seen photographs of this thing that was in a jar, then I would have, laughed and said, of course, that's a Hollywood prop or something. But we actually went to Jaime Maussan's office. He's a very major investigator of the paranormal, which I'm very much open to. I come from a scientific background, but I like to use my right brain as much as my left. And he simply took this jar out and put it on his desk and said, "What do you think of that?" And as a trained biologist, I spent the next half an hour looking at this little winged creature, and it looked to me very much like it once had been a living being. And so I took some photographs of it. Ellie Marzulli, who's done actually a recent documentary called Watchers 10, has it documented in there. He sent x-rays of this to an American veterinarian, and the veterinarian believes that it also was once a living being. So we got the whole background story on it, and Mexican people have a tendency to be far more open-minded, or Latin American people in general, than a lot of Western people. And so they tend to easily accept this, or they also tend to be able to tell you stories of things which a lot of other people won't believe, but I definitely think that whatever this thing was, it was living, and it died about 5 years ago, and was actually shot by a farmer using buckshot.
That is pretty nuts. Buckshot?
It's pretty wild.
Well, that's what showed up in the X-ray. All these little spheres, and because he's a veterinarian and has seen, a cow brought in having been shot, or a horse or whatever, he said, well, that's, he was able to specifically tell you what size of buckshot it was.
That's really amazing. So, and that brings up another good point. It's amazing what we're able to discover now in this field because of technology. What with the advancement of different types of DNA testing, and being able to really bring technology into the sort of archaeology, anthropology field. I feel like we're going to be able to make big leaps forward in this. When it comes to this information. So we recently covered your findings, your DNA findings on the Paracas skulls on our Adept Initiates blog. And having personally followed your research for the last 6 years, and actually having the chance to visit you in Paracas and see these skulls for myself, I would really love for you to kind of clarify, because there's so much controversy around these findings. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's some people who aren't quite sure what the findings mean. Would you mind just clarifying sort of what you've been able to find out because of these DNA tests that you've been able to run?
Sure. Well, we had one test done, I think about 4 years ago, by a Russian geneticist who had also been involved with what's called the Star Child skull of Lloyd Pye, and he presented me with results from one skull where he said this is not human, or components of this DNA are not human. They don't fit into the evolutionary tree, and of course that exploded on the internet. The unfortunate thing is that he was fired soon after that, because he kept trying to do on the side more DNA testing. His boss found out and fired him after telling him explicitly, "You're not allowed to test these elongated skulls anymore." So when you have one result like that, it's not scientifically significant. You need like 10, 15. So very recently, we had 4 skulls tested, 3 from Paracas and another one from Peru. And each one came up with a haplogroup, which is a definition of your ethnicity, which were very startling. This 20-month-old baby Paracas, who had an elongated head and had strawberry blonde hair, which is not Native American, turned out to be U2E1, which is Northern European, or the Baltic states. And that completely shocked me. So I contacted the lab and said, could you please rerun the test, because this must be contamination. And they did. They replicated it, and they said, no, this is the haplogroup we found. And then 3 others. One turned out to be haplogroup T2B, which is also European / Middle Eastern. And then another one was H2, which is also European Middle Eastern. And the fourth one was H2A, which is again European Middle Eastern. And that doesn't fit into the whole theory that all people of Native American heritage, that their ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge, because nobody would be going from Europe across all of Asia to cross the Bering Land Bridge. So now we're starting to theorize that clearly other people were in the Americas and took a different route, likely by sea, either the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean and then the Pacific.
And that's really just a huge game changer when it comes to how we think of the past and what we think in terms of how advanced society and civilization was. I just want to drive that point home for a lot of people who may not really understand the implications of that. Being able to travel across large bodies of water is such a big deal. What do you think that could really mean for how we look at this, at our archaeology in general, and understanding how advanced we really were?
Well, very much so. And I've been a sailor for decades. And so I've studied the wind and sea currents of both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And if somebody was to lead the Middle East, say through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, you're not actually at sea all that long before you encounter a landmass. And so they could have gone through, they could have hugged along the coastline, and then they could have gone through Indonesia and or the Philippines and then into Polynesia. And that's where the red hair is really intriguing because, again, that's not a Native American characteristic at all. Native Americans, when you think of them, are black-haired and have a tendency to have dark skin or very tannable skin. So the Paracas turned up to genetically have had, or at least the royalty had genetically red hair that is 30% thinner than Native American hair and is also wavy. And that's been proven by a number of experts. So automatically you're looking at a different ethnicity. And as you backtrack through Polynesia, you find that on Easter Island, there used to be red-haired people living there, and then into Tahiti and Hawaii and New Zealand, so all the Polynesian group. And then when you try to trace where does red hair originally come from, it's not what most people think in terms of Scotland or Ireland. It's in fact Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. So we're talking the Middle East.
Yeah, that's a pretty amazing breakthrough that will definitely impact the future of this entire global investigation into our species' history.
And you definitely know how to connect the dots here. I mean, you have one book coming out today about Akhenaten, and I hear you're already working on your next book about the Paracas culture on the other side of the world. What can you tell us about it? And actually, is this book 21? Is this going to be book 21, Brien? What are we at now for numbers?
Yes, we are. We're at book 21. I write a book usually when I can't find a book on a topic that fascinates me. And I automatically start researching the subject. And so the Paracas, of course, I've been studying for many years, and the only real written works about them are academic papers. And academic papers tend to be extremely boring with too much jargon and references in them. So I decided to write a book about the Paracas culture because they're very mysterious. They had elongated heads, they had red hair. If they had red hair, it also means they likely had very light skin. And living in an environment like Paracas where it's constant sunshine, these people would have a difficulty. So genetically, they seem to have been, again, distinct from the general population that we find in Peru, who are, of Native American heritage. So that's why I took the topic on. And with the ongoing DNA testing, I want to present a story about a people who lived in the distant past that nobody honestly has studied no archaeologist has been studying these people for the last 50 years.
Yeah, wow. That is a huge missed opportunity to really learn about our hidden history. Speaking of, one of my favorite historical figures is surrounded by conflicting information. It's part of the reason why we covered him in our digital series, Ancient Egypt Mystery Schools. So I'm really excited to read your book, Akhenaten, the Heretic Pharaoh, which comes out today on Amazon. And without giving away too much here, Brien, can you share some of the details about this misunderstood figure?
Sure. Well, Akhenaten is possibly the most fascinating of all of the pharaohs because he changed so many things. He was very much a rebel. And I only use the term heretic because that's what the Amun priesthood, who controlled all of Egyptian society at that time. The pharaohs, such as his father, Amenhotep III, was probably more of a puppet than anything else. And so Akhenaten, who was born Amenhotep IV, got so pissed off with this that he decided to transform Egyptian society. So he moved the capital city from Thebes and constructed his own city called Akhenaten, actually in an environment that was megalithic. There had been a very ancient culture living there long before. He changed his name to Akhenaten, which means the shadow of Aten, or the highest, meaning a monotheistic concept. And he was very much adept in the mystery schools of Egypt. He knew that there had been a time long before dynastic Egypt where he descended from an advanced civilization. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to take this information and show it to the public. So that's why there was so much artwork involved. He didn't really express himself as being this profound guy like all the other pharaohs did, such as Ramses II. He didn't seem to be egotistical. He really wanted to bring light to the spiritual darkness of Egypt. He returned the people or the belief system back to the idea of a monotheistic single creator, which was the ancient Egyptian concept prior to the Amun priesthood. Of course, he was very much in love with his beautiful wife, Nefertiti. And so, because I've been to Egypt 4 times, and he's one of the least known because his whole history they tried to wipe out. They destroyed all the sculptures and art. They razed his city to the ground. They probably chopped him into pieces and tried to wipe him from the record. That he, to me, is a hero. And so I wanted to research him. And whenever I start researching something, automatically it's book time.
Yeah. Now, Brien, you were recently in Egypt again. I'm curious, during this last trip, was there anything new that may support the idea of a correlation between the ancient civilizations of Egypt and the cultures of South America?
Well, some of the people in our group are trying to look at there having been one global advanced civilization 12,000 years ago, but I personally don't think that's the case. I think whoever was doing the work in Peru and Bolivia was a completely different people than those in Egypt, because the execution is very different. In Egypt, you have a lot of linear work, such as the pyramids, which is layer upon layer upon layer. A lot of 90-degree angles, such as the boxes in the Serapeum, which, if your listeners don't know about them, each one weighs 100 tons. Whereas in Peru, you have a tendency in the highlands of having much more organic polygonal shapes. That stuff blends into the whole environment. It's almost like a Japanese approach at gardening. Everything's very fits with nature, whereas the stuff in Egypt is like in your face to some degree because of the huge scale, such as the Great Pyramid, which is 500 feet tall. So I think there were different civilizations involved. There may have been others too, pertaining to how we started the talk, as in the so-called Atlanteans. They may have been a different people altogether.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love about your approach to this work, Brien. When new facts are introduced, you don't hesitate to reevaluate your own findings and incorporate new evidence. Now, shifting gears a bit, we can't have you on a show called Music Marketing Metaphysics without diving into your experience building a massive following online and your prolific content creation. I mean, you're constantly churning out videos and taking us out into the field with you. Our listeners, I know, would love to hear more about what your journey has been like over the last decade or so, being one of those people who has successfully built a large dedicated following online within this niche.
Well, I'm honestly I'm constantly in shock about this. I never set out my task as becoming famous, but I very much embrace it, because I embrace not my ego, but I embrace the ability to be able to be in contact with so many people around the world. And I learn as much from my audiences and listeners as they do from me. So it's a daily joy to learn new things and to be able to have formats such as the internet to be able to express them. So I'm very thankful to those who show interest in my work, because it's not my work, it's ours. It belongs to all of us. And We grew up with this very confined sense of history that's been heavily edited, with a lot of stuff deleted. And now, thanks to technology, we're able to uncover things which have literally been hidden. And so that's why it's fun, because I think, as a human family, we have a divine right to learn everything about who we are, where we come from, etc., and to embrace all of this as one people. I personally don't regard, for example, the works of the ancient Egyptians as being belonging to the Egyptians, because there's so few people who are actually descended from the ancient Egyptians. And the same is the case in Peru and Bolivia. There's also not a huge level of local interest. So I'm glad there's a global audience for this stuff. I'm very happy that people come down and explore these places either with me, or if my videos are a good tool for them to start opening their eyes about it. I'm very pleased with where I am right now.
It's interesting that you mentioned that there's a global audience and not so much of a local interest at some of these sites, because we've found the same thing, and we connect with people from all over the world who just are so passionate about it, and a lot of these people who are listening are also very interested in how you manage your brand. Maybe you don't think about it, but we definitely want to kind of share with them sort of what is it that drives you to be so prolific with your content creation. I mean, you're churning out books. How do you make the time to do all of that and manage your social media?
I have a terribly short ability to be able to not do something, and I've been like that since I was a little kid. So if I'm not actively engaged in something, I get bored almost instantaneously. And I put in from 6 a.m. till 6 o'clock at night, 7 days a week at this, because it's what's in my heart. It's what I love. It's what fascinates me. The idea that I actually can make discoveries that other people haven't is exciting. I am a professional adventurer, which is wild. 10 years ago, if you asked me, would I be that? It's like, no, I don't think so. But it's working that way, and it's been going because the audience gets bigger, because we have access to so much information, because I have the financial ability to be able to travel around a fair bit, and it's just my basic philosophy is the more I give away, the more the universe decides that I deserve something. And money's a great tool. So I'm constantly thinking of new ideas, of new places to visit, new films to make. And there always is the idea of trying to be able to sell some of this stuff, because I'm hardly going to do it all for nothing. So I recently just got on Vimeo. So I'm making pay-per-view long videos of 45 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes.
Oh, that's awesome. That sounds great. For a lot of people that don't know, this is the way that, people are being able to now monetize this kind of content, because for so long, it's been very difficult to turn, social media into, sort of a money-making thing. And I love that you said that, your primary focus is just to create the content and share this information and trust that the universe is going to sort of return on your passion, right? I mean, would you say you're the kind of person that believes that you should just follow your passion and sort of the money and everything else will follow?
It seems to work that way for me, definitely. It was something like 7 years ago. I thought, because I'd been in Peru for on and off for 3 years before that, filming, taking photographs, and then I thought, maybe I should put a video on YouTube. And then that spread to 100 videos, and now I'm at almost 850 videos. And as soon as the opportunity came to be able to monetize, of course I did that, because it's just, if you can do something and make some money from it, what's wrong with that? Trying to sell everything is problematic. Trying to give away everything for nothing is problematic. So a good balance of the two The two of them feed off each other anyway. And as you said, the internet is becoming an astonishing tool to be able to make money doing what you want to do.
Yeah, I like to call the internet the great equalizer now, because we're starting to see this trend of people not having to necessarily rely on one big company to fund things. You can sort of come up with creative ways to create content, form partnerships, and actually turn it into a viable business. So that being said, what I really love to hear is just where people can find you online, because you're on so many different platforms. I know you've mentioned a couple brand new ones on the show today. Where is the best place for people to find your work and connect with you and just really learn how to find your books?
Actually, my main website is the best, and that's www.hiddenincatours.com. And on there, it's called Hidden Inca Tours, but the tour part is about 5% of the content. The rest of it is connections to the 800 plus YouTube videos, articles, interviews such as this, photo sets, books, etc. Limited links. I don't think the link concept works that much anymore, but I have a reasonably active blog that I have there as well. And then a new site is being relaunched called hiddenhumanhistory.com. And that is going to be a much bigger site with contributions from many other researchers from around the world, including you guys, I hope.
Absolutely. We'd love to be part of that. We are big supporters of your research, and we love working with you.
Speaking of your research, I remember reading recently on your site about a trip to a very small village in Bolivia where you encountered a pretty startling find. Was it Patapatani?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know we didn't get a chance to go into it, but I definitely want to hear sort of what your findings were there. I mean, what you found when you were there.
Yeah, that was really quite amazing, because I'd seen photographs of this this humanoid skeleton, I have to describe it that way, in a fetal position, and trying to find out where it actually was located, because I found photos of the excavation, but then it led to a dead end. And so my friend Antonio Portugal, who's a very prolific Bolivian author, decided to go on the Altiplano, which is the high plains of Bolivia, to the southern shore of Lake Titicaca to try to find this village called Patapatani. And he was actually successful, and he found this little museum, and he was able to take photographs of the skeleton. So we happened to be on a tour with an American radiologist, and it was just one of those amazing circumstances. He came primarily for Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, and so for the next day, I just in the morning we had breakfast, and I said, "Well, Ken, what's your profession?" And he said, "I'm a radiologist." And I went, "Oh my God!" And for those who don't know, a radiologist is somebody who studies X-rays in order to figure out human health problems. So there is no better expert to look at a skeleton than a radiologist. So we traveled on the Altiplano, and we got lost a bunch of times asking local people where Patapatani was. Finally, we found it after about 4.5 hours of driving, and nobody else would be able to find it. And inside this museum, there was a skeleton, and Ken observed the skeleton. He also observed a fetus that was in another case next to it. And so I didn't ask him too much about it until the next morning when he said, okay, I have a theory. I'm 90% sure that the fetus and the skeleton were mother and baby. And the most intriguing thing is the skull is much, much larger than a human skull. It's very cone-shaped. And he automatically said, that is not a human skull, meaning not Homo sapiens sapiens. I said, are you sure? And he said, it's not a human skull. There's no way you can bind a skull like that to get that size. And the baby as well. The baby skull was elongated and is the size of its torso. So he believes that the baby died in utero, as in the mother, at about 7 months, and that the skeleton was about 12. And so he believes that both mother and baby died during childbirth. They were of royal lineage, so they were buried in what's called a stone chulpa tower. And that's the first time I've been able to get a medical professional to be able to nail this down. He said of both of them, I don't know what they are, but they're not Homo sapiens sapiens.
Which is pretty amazing to have some kind of hard evidence that there is something other than humans. But before everyone runs around saying they're aliens, what are some of the possibilities for what these elongated skulls could be? What kind of species they could be? I mean, there's a lot of people that are convinced that this is smoking gun evidence of aliens. There are people who aren't so easily convinced. What is your take on it when it comes to what these skulls are?
Well, I honestly believe that they are a subspecies of human being, because when Ken looked at the skeleton, he said, it's very much human. I don't see, there weren't 6 fingers or anything like that. There weren't a different number of ribs. All of the bones, he said, looked normal, but he said the skull, no, there's no way. So I think we're looking at Homo sapiens something. And that'll take more DNA testing, of course. But in the history of humanity, of course, we've had examples of hominid or humanoid life forms that have been wiped out by us. Neanderthal is one that most likely was exterminated by Homo sapiens sapiens. Another subspecies called the Denisovan were exterminated by us. These little hobbit people who lived in Indonesia something like 13,000 years ago were very likely wiped out by us. So I think the incredibly aggressive nature of Homo sapiens sapiens could very well mean that there may have been several different subspecies of human that existed in the past, and they were likely either absorbed by or exterminated by us.
Of course, our natural human aggression, which is an issue that we all need to continue working on as a species. We seem to kind of have a tendency to want to conquer things in general, just throughout the last several thousand years. So it makes you wonder, huh?
Very much so. And of course, it's still going on today. In the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a human tendency. Unfortunately, it is a human tendency. I wish it wasn't, but it is.
Brien, I want to ask you a little bit about your take on the ancient cultures of Mexico and Central America. I've spent quite a bit of time there exploring some of the hidden pyramids, and a few weeks ago had my wedding in the Yucatan. I noticed you've been recently posting some really intriguing content on your YouTube channel about the mysteries of Mexico. And there was one on your Facebook about Mayans with red hair. What has your experience been there, and how does it relate to your work in Peru and Bolivia?
Well, I'm planning on spending a lot more time in Mexico because the country is amazing. The people are wonderful. All these stories that you hear that Mexico is a complete mess of drug gangs is kind of nonsense. I'm sure that's near the border, but Mexico City is a very sophisticated city. And there's a great pride in the Mexican people that I found of their pre-Columbian heritage, which is wonderful. So unfortunately, there have only been scant stories about these red-haired Mayans so far. The only references are that they were of a level of nobility. So that's something that I definitely want to pursue on future trips.
What do you have coming up, and where can our audience go to learn more about how to participate in these trips?
Sure. Well, again, that's all at hiddenincatours.com. November, we have a tour of Peru and Bolivia, which is already full. We've got 34 people, which is the maximum we ever do. Then January, we're hoping there'll be enough interest for us to explore megalithic aspects of India. And then in March, we're going back to Egypt for the 5th time. In June, we have a tour of the celebration of the Inca Festival of the Sun called the Inti Raymi. And I'm sure there'll be all sorts of little interspersed things in between those. My webmaster is about to put up some day tours that I'll be giving here in Paracas, because now Senior Juan Navarro's museum has moved from this little building to a massive building. It's astonishing. The new Juan Navarro Museum is amazing. And they also just reopened the Teo Museum, which is in Paracas, and it's exclusively about the Paracas culture. And it's brand new and has hundreds of pieces. So that's very exciting for the Paracas area in terms of cultural tourism.
It's really amazing, Brien, with all these trips, all your efforts, everything online, and you find the time to write all these books. We actually just got a question from a member in our audience that wants to know how you managed to write so many books. Could you maybe elaborate more on your process? Like, do you write as you're on these trips? Do you try to maybe block off a small period in between? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, like I say, I've got a very low threshold of boredom. So, and I don't watch TV. I don't do things like watch TV or anything. I'm always absorbing information. So in general, what happens is I'll start thinking about a topic, and then it'll germinate for often about 6 months. And then I just start with a blank, computer screen and start hammering thoughts down, and then start accessing the internet for photographs and other content, as well, of course, as my own photos and things. And so it's during a period when I'm not traveling that I tend to write, and that's why I was able to finish the Akhenaten book very recently, because I've spent the last 2 weeks here in Paracas with not much else to do. And then automatically when I finished that, I thought, oh yeah, Paracas, I should start writing about that. And so I'm already halfway through that one. I've got like 50 pages of text already with that one. And I have no idea what number 22 will be, but I'm sure there will be some idea that germinates and then presents itself. And when I have a week, or usually I need at least a week off in order to be able to get a decent amount of content down. But that's basically my process.
And perhaps you'll be able to start including more aerial shots now that you're bringing the drone out to some of these sacred sites, which I also think is fascinating, being able to see that footage on your YouTube channel, the youtube.com/Brien Foerster, for members in our audience who may not be familiar. Again, hiddeninkertours.com. Akhenaten, the Heretic Pharaoh, out today on Amazon. Brien, is it only available on Amazon, or can folks get it direct from your website as well?
Yeah, I just sent it to my webmaster, who's actually the webmaster of the Dalai Lama, by the way. And he's a wonderful, genius IE guy, or IT guy. And so he should be putting it up as an ebook within the next week. So that's the second option. But I don't bother publishing piles of my own books, because living in Peru, it's almost impossible to ship anything anywhere. That's why I use Amazon Print on Demand, because it's multinational, it's direct. So that I think is the way of the future. The idea of printing 1,000 books and having them in your garage for a while is very 20th century. I'm very much looking at 21st century options for everything.
It has been a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show. We can't wait to have you come back in the future to follow up with you and catch up on all of your research and latest breakthroughs. Thanks again for being a guest.
Well, you two guys are so brilliant, and it was such an honor to hang out with you at Contact in the Desert, which I will be at next year, because the day that I gave my talk, the organizer just came up and said, you are coming next year. So hopefully I'll see you there. I think it's in May at Joshua Tree next year. But I love visiting California. I love going back to the land of my birth, America, and hope to see you guys there, if not before.
Quick question for you, Brien. With regards to California, have you been to the LA Natural History Museum to see the elongated skull that they have on display there?
No, I'll have to do that.
Next time you're in California, you'll have to link up with Ramon and me, and we'll make the trip.
Brilliant.
hiddeninkatoas.com.
This episode is brought to you by AncientEgyptMysterySchools.com. Immerse yourself in the hidden teachings of the ancient mystery traditions. For thousands of years, initiates have examined the meanings of sacred texts, said to hold the secret path towards ascension. But how can we decipher these often enigmatic phrases and symbols? Join the line of ascended masters on a quest for deeper truths of our universe. Follow along as we trace the powerful evolution of humankind's most illuminating secrets. Begin to embark on your journey today and discover your divine rite of passage at AncientEgyptMysterySchools.com. Com.